Right, today I want to demonstrate how you might approach a life study, initially using tones. Now, in a way, if you can recall part of the dim, distant past, those of you who did geography at school, you might have had some manic geography teacher who requested that you do the contours of a given country. And you proceeded to do so, after which you may well have been asked to put in geographical or topographical aspects. Now, let's hope we get Wales in case there's a general complaint. You could either do this from looking at a map or from memory. And I'm going to apply pretty much the same philosophy to doing a life study. And the point I'm trying to make to you is that when you begin any particular picture, remember the impact is important. So if you start off using a kind of darning needle in the initial prospect, and you may well become very much lost in the snowblind of a sheet of cartridge or a canvas or whichever medium you're using. Okay, let's apply that same theory to the human form. Now, with the help of Sarah from the local life class, I'm going to demonstrate how we can do this in a similar fashion. Now, to do so, rather than start off with a black or intensely dark colour, it pays in many ways to begin with a medium one. Don't worry about lines, you can catch up on these later on. The problem with lines is, at least in the initial stages of doing anything like this, is that they exercise too much of a controlling feature. And if you start controlling your work early doors, then it's quite difficult to change it if you've used an excess of lines. And if you make mistakes, so what? I mean, get into the habit of having 3 papers, 3 canvases, 3 boards, whatever you're working in, so that at least one out of that 3 might give you the promise or potential for a successful piece of work. If 3 don't work, we'll try a 4th one and a 5th. It's a numbers game. The more attempts you make, the more you learn, the more you figure out where your mistakes are. And again, keeping to that medium strength of colour, you can work out cartographic areas, just like we did in the map a moment ago, in the body. Now these may well have a distinctive shape, in which case that's the one to follow. But whichever the case, if you can detect a specific contour, mass, or area that has a recognisable feature or character, and that's the one to go for. Doesn't mean you can't use lines or you're prohibited from using lines. Just keep them to a minimum. If you want to add dark areas or light areas, consequently, you can do so. There's no hard and fast rule. This tends to just liberate the kind of work you might do or the kind of approach you might use. And it also creates an impact on the sheet, and that's important, because if you start off doing a perfect drawing on a sheet this size, it's only about 6 inches square, then you've lost. So use bigger brushes than normal, so that you don't end up with the temptation of stitching things up. Give me 1 second. Oh, the text is falling out. And as you proceed, you'll then be tempted to use darker or lighter colours depending on where they take place in the figure. But you know, the thing about it is that it's basically an area of shadow which is obscured from light, so it has a positive shape in many ways, and if it doesn't, or you can detect at least, or you can invent what you think the most detectable shape on it is. But the main thing, as I've said already, is to break up this psychological barrier the sheet has for you. Do that, then you're on the right track. Okay, let's add a piece of dark to this. And again, I'm following areas and exaggerating where these dark passages take place. Now you can use any colour you want. I mean, there is a theory that some people have if you're painting Native Americans or Chinese people or Oriental people or Caucasians, that you must use colours naively, like black, brown, yellow, pink for show. So try and avoid that, because irrespective of the race of the person, you can use any colour you want. And the more inventive you are with the colour, the more interesting your picture is going to be. So you've got plenty of time to do details, like thumbs and fingers and stuff like that, in the latter stages of your work. Okay, now when that's done, keeping to fairly similar size of brushes, you can start to use other colours on top in the light sense. And again, you're looking for continents of light. Always keep in mind there's a shape that you can detect, right? Even though it's very rough in character. And using your brush in different levels and different angles also helps keep a sense of movement inside the work. You pretty much use primary colours as you go along. You're not having to pass law to say you've got to use one thing. Or subtlety of colour, just because skin tones are normally fairly obscure in terms of pure colour. I mean, there's plenty of time to control this, so level off the traffic light consistency of what you're doing later on in the work. Now remember, this is only an approach from the beginning. If you wanted to start off using, for example, issues in light, then feel free to do so. And also remember that in the latter stages, or even halfway between, there's plenty of time to take a really thin brush and be much more exact in your language. But again, I must caution to do that later on in the work. Otherwise, the multiplicity of lines is going to cause all sorts of havoc and problems to resolve. Okay, remember this is only an initial approach. It's not going to be a finished piece of work. I'm going to show you a more finished work in a moment or two. But this may suffice, or help, when you're coming to do this kind of work. And it's not just the actual life figure, obviously, it's any object, landscape, has the same parallel. But the main thing to remember is, irrespective of whether you make mistakes or not, you've broken up this psychological barrier that sheets sometimes give you, right? And that's important. You do that, you're halfway there, okay? Don't go and buy expensive cut and watercolour papers to do this. You know, practice no sheets of wallpaper, newsprint, whichever, until you're more confident and more resolved in what you do. Okay, let's leave that for that. Meantime, okay, Sarah, that's fine, thanks. I want to show you a piece that's more finished just before we stop, which is akin to the one that Sarah has. And you can see what I'm talking about.